because the cabaret becomes an important institution in the 1880s. So this is, and as we will talk about later, a fair amount later, it's an example of new forms of mass entertainment. Not the radio yet, not the television yet, not even the movies yet, which we'll get to on Thursday, but new forms of mass entertainment, and this gives rise to, well, this kind of singing had already begun before, but it now becomes widely popular. Now, what I love about Yvette Guilbert is, first of all, she lived forever. So she starts singing in the 1880s, late 1880s. She's one of the first performers, as I'll talk about later, to appear at the Moulin Rouge, which still exists, and about which movies have been made, which is one of the first cabarets in Paris that does this kind of music. And what I also love about Yvette Guilbert, which we won't have time for right now, which links to Thursday, is that she was Sigmund Freud's favorite singer. And towards the end of his life, he actually met her in Paris. She lived so long, she was still singing in the 1930s, and this is a 1930s movie. It's not a movie, I'm sorry. It's a 1930s recording with some still photographs of her, so you get to see what she looks like. So we'll start with that while we're waiting for everybody to get here. Well, I have a different song down. I was originally going to start, because I actually downloaded it on my iTunes, Yvette Guilbert singing La Soularde, the Drunken Woman, but I decided when I found this YouTube one that showed a few pictures of an early cabaret, etc., that we would start with it instead. Okay, so today is Imperialism and Mass Politics. You're starting to read Joseph Conrad. And we will, at some point today, I hope, have Willis, who is going to offer us a few thoughts on the subject of Joseph Conrad, but we will press forward. The reason these two things are together is because, partly, we don't have time to discuss them separately. Imperialism should have a whole lecture to it, but instead you're going to read Conrad as a way of reminding us that during all of the period that we're talking about, Europe is increasingly involved with the rest of the world and is increasingly dominating the rest of the world. I'll talk a little bit today about how the forms of domination change over time. It's related to mass politics, and perhaps this is the most important thing to get out of this lecture, that in the 1870s and 1880s, we have the appearance of the question of how will the masses be incorporated into the political sphere. This happens because increasingly there is universal manhood suffrage by the end of the 19th century. We'll talk about that in greater detail. That means, what do we do about the fact that there are all these people appearing now as potential voters? What will the lower classes do, the lower class men do, the working class men do, when they have access to the vote? Will they vote out the middle classes and the upper classes? Will they vote for the expropriation of property? Will they realize Marx's dream through the ballot box? So what we're going to talk about today is the rise of mass politics, the rise of mass culture, and the cabaret is important for us here, because the issue about, and this is a fascinating question, this will be the beginning of the debate of the meaning of mass culture. Is mass culture a way of making people less discontent? Does it soften the edges of what the working classes want? Is mass culture, as Marx described religion, just an opiate for the masses, an opium for the masses? Does it just dull their senses? Is this what mass culture is about? Imperialism fits into this because two different reasons. starting in the 19th century, the form of European interaction with their colonies undergoes a profound shift. We go from slave-based colonies in the Caribbean as the main focus of European interest in the 18th century to new colonies in Africa and Asia, newly important sometimes and sometimes new, that Europeans administer and control, but they don't tend to settle in as a major, they don't force out all the local inhabitants as they do in the Caribbean, where the locals all die of disease or in fighting. The Caribs of the Caribbean largely disappear. Africans don't disappear. Indians don't disappear. They are now controlled by Europeans in the form we call imperialism. And imperialism becomes a part of mass politics. Another way in which it is thought that the masses lose the possible critical edge of wanting to overturn the system is they instead become entranced by stories of Stanley and Livingstone in Africa, of missionaries to Africa, of what Europeans are able to accomplish in other parts of the world. So these things are related, mass politics and imperialism. Willis, did you want to? Willis is going to offer us some of his views on Conrad for you to think about in terms of your paper. And I'm going to pass him my microphone to do this.
So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Willis Okechigi. I'm a TA for Section 1A and 1K. I'm in the African History Department, so which is kind of a different field to what we're studying. And so when Professor Hunt asked me if I could give my opinion on what Conrad is writing, I said I would, but not necessarily kind of use Conrad's own words or go into detail into what Conrad says, but actually to look back at when I first read Conrad and how I used it. Specifically in African history, I'm actually looking at environmental history. And with it, I'm actually researching on human-wildlife conflicts in Kenya, where I come from, and actually arguing that there's a conflict of interest how Europeans viewed nature, which we've seen some of it alluded in Romanticism and art in the 17th, 18th century, and the way Africans viewed nature. And you can see this, you can see some of this with Conrad's language. So what I was going to talk about, I was kind of late, I was running about 50 minutes late, but really is the way Europe actually creates the other, which is what Achebe might be alluding to, which is that according to Europe, Africa is just another, I mean, there's all this, he might go as far as saying Conrad is racist in his prose and everything, but my take on it is, even though I side with him, I might not go as extreme as that, because Conrad, some people have argued that Conrad might not have been racist in his language, but he might have been pointing out to some of the atrocities that were going on in Belgium, Congo at the time. It's not
activating a virus program, and it is not happening.
Oh, you just need to turn it off. Yes. But anyway, for a background, that is where I'm coming from. Europe's creation of the other, which is what, when I first read the paper, when I first read the book, actually, that's what I was focusing on. And also using nature as a way of where Conrad is juxtaposing the savages of Africa and civilization in Europe. And we can see this already in Europe, where there is modernity and civilization against savages. Whoever was considered savages, which has its origins in I think 9th century or medieval Europe, all the way through, which probably Dr. Hunt might correct me on this, but as the agrarian revolution went on in Europe, there was this notion that those who were left in the forest, who had not, quote unquote, seen the light, were backward, and thus savages. And there's I think a dictionary definition of it, which it's a French origin, so that's debatable. But that is where I'm kind of coming from, juxtaposing that with what Conrad sees in Africa, or what Conrad influences in his book. Is it?
Is it not
Just no tiny.
Is it not
It's a PowerPoint.
It is a PowerPoint.
Yeah. My computer just.
Well, my computer's not showing up here, but I can get PowerPoint.
But how Europe creates the other, we can just take that back to Europe itself and what we've learned so far in this course. We've looked at Darwin, we've looked at social Darwinism. There's something that we haven't actually looked at, which is a Hamitic hypothesis. And all this actually play out in Africa when the missionaries come and explorers. And then, of course, imperialism follows soon after. Pretty much it was, there was, oh God, if I can, what is, I don't know if this will play. But I wanted to sort of start my, so from that clip, what you're getting is that there is kind of an opposing sort of contradictions that you get, where on the one hand, Africa is savage, but still, as later on, which would be developed, would be this notion of romantic, the nostalgia of juxtaposing it against modernity. There's a noble savage image that comes, character that comes around, and that plays a lot into nature. I work as a guide back home, and so part of what I see when I look at that clip, and I've used Rider Haggard, that was King Solomon's Mines was based off a novel by Rider Haggard, and I see all these misconceptions about Africa. There's a lot there that I could go into, but it reminded me of what Achebe is actually arguing, that Africa is being misrepresented as late as 1970s, but by the mass media, for example. There's also literature's role, and that's where he takes Conrad. He might not actually be probably directing it all at Conrad, but he uses Conrad as a way of showing that through the prose, the literature, because Conrad was writing in the early, Conrad's book came out in the early 1900, 1899, started writing excerpts of it, and 1900 when it was published, which was 10 years after Conrad had actually visited Africa. But my argument has been that literature has actually influenced the perception of Africa to the outside world, mainly Europe and the US in this case. And when nature, and nowhere does, that plays more in nature, where there's all these myths of wild Africa that are out there. So there's some mentions that you've had. There's the influence of, I've talked about literature, but there's also explorers like Morton Stanley, Henry Morton Stanley, who first went out in search of Livingstone, and who was an explorer, found him close to the Congo, the present-day Congo. Later went back to Europe. In one of his slides, you'll actually see his own words of what he referred to Africa as being, but was also very influential in the lead-up to the scramble for Africa. So he managed to convince Leopold, who actually sent him back to Africa, to be in charge of one of his trading empires, colonies. So this is what Achebe is arguing, that Africa is as an antithesis of civilization. But it's not just Africa. Edward Said also challenges this Euro-American notion of anybody who's non-European or non-Western in this case, as we've defined the West in this course, as the other. And a lot of it is constructed from what Europe at the time thinks of them having this superior intellectual field, socioeconomic, whatever it was, that they have, that they thought that these other nations that they came across did not. And we can see that in Darwin. Darwin may not have been explicitly racist. He didn't go as far as pretty much being, I think, defined as racist, but he did, in his theory of evolution, have this play around with what was going on at the time, where they had actually about four. There's the Negroid, the Europeans, Caucasians, and the Mongolids, and the Caucasian, and Afroasians, where there was four categorizations of human beings. And of all of us, for all of us, Africa, actually, Africans, or the Negroid in this case, was at the bottom. And you can see that in some of the passages in Darwin's excerpt that we read, where he's talking about if somebody picked a Negroid and a European, there would be some distinct differences. He didn't go as far as take it from a racist standpoint, but he did think that there are some amongst humans who were not as quite evolved, quote unquote, as the Europeans in this case. And then, of course, social Darwinists would take it to a different level and play around with more and be more racist about it, and so did the Hamitic myth, which, for any of you who have a background of a Hamitic myth, and this played around in Africa, it was based off the Old Testament, that Noah's 3 sons, one of them, I think, there was Japheth, but one of his sons, Ham actually, did not cover him when he came back home staggering drunk and he was naked. And instead of covering him or something, did not do anything about it. And so he was cast, and all his descendants were cast into slavery. Where where Ham's descendants become Africans is all subject to myth, because nowhere is it known that Noah's descendants were black in this case. So a lot of it is that the myths of Africans, the Hamitic myth, where Africans would be considered inferior in every level that you can think of, would play around, and this comes around, I think, is part of what leads to imperialism in Africa, leads to Kipling, when Kipling is talking about the burden, take up the white man's burden, although it does kind of call onto the US, which never was a colonizer in Africa, but was actually present at the Berlin Conference as an observer. But at the time, the US had this anti-imperialism I think the citizens were definitely against imperialism. But it was eventually drawn into it, I think in 1898, when it went into Cuba and the Philippines. More so, they thought there was trade for them, but also as a benevolent nature. And more, the US would send missionaries to Africa, for example, out of this benevolent nature to try and save the souls of the heathen Africans in this case. Let's see, got there. So there is Achebe. He teaches at Bard University, Bard College in New York. He's a literary critic, so it's easy to see why he picks apart Conrad's prose in this case. But he's pretty much arguing that Conrad's piece should not be taken to be one of the greatest works of art. Well, it's debatable, it's arguable. He says it's not, but whether Conrad is racist, again, I went over this earlier, is arguable. But definitely there are stereotypical misconceptions about Africa. But what does Conrad tell us about the Congo Free State? There is brutality, there's slavery going on, and there is all of this is going on under King Leopold II at the time. Now, something else that Africanists have argued is that whereas Conrad might be pointing out to what Leopold is doing, the brutality of Leopold, this is not more so. It is this debate going on even within Europe itself as to who is a model civilian, model citizen in this case. We can see some of the excerpts where even Europe themselves are actually competing against who should be the model civilian, quote unquote, in this case. When it comes to Africa, there is this notion as to who is a model colonizer, who is a better colonizer. To Africans, none of them is, because even though there is this extreme, Leopold just was an example of the extremity of brutality. The same case was going on in other places, in the Cameroons, where Germany was a colonizer in Germany. As late as 1902, they were still debating in the Third Reich about slavery going on in Germany, in Cameroon, which was under German colonization. For Britain, it was more about economic imperialism. How they got into colonies, how many people they killed did not matter, because as long as they got what they wanted, and that was all that mattered. So for Africa, it didn't matter whether one was extreme or the other. The end result was that Africa was actually pillaged by the Europeans, and the European nation colonizers in this case. So this is what Stanley said when he went back to Europe after his exploration. He pretty much said that Africa was there for the taking. And he's tying it to the Industrial Revolution in Europe. It's 1878, of course. Slavery by then had been legally abolished, but that did not mean that slavery had ended. The UK was influential, Britain was influential in the abolishment of slavery. They were on the forefront of it. But a lot of it was just what they call the legitimate trade. And this is what Stanley might be alluding to, because he's giving this talk in Manchester that, you know, there's 40 million people naked out there, and all the cotton spinners of Manchester are waiting to clothe them. And he also pegs in a quote, a claim for the Christian missionaries, the heathen souls are out there for them to go and save. Leopold takes it and basically says, I mean to miss no chance to get a share of this magnificent African cake. And so part of his scramble for Africa is reacting to what once Leopold kind of takes this area of Congo, sends Henry Stanley Morton out there. Europe realizes because he takes it as part of his own, he annexes not for Belgium, but for his own economic purposes. So Bismarck and the rest decide that this is not a good precedent, and there's a way that they need to be able to trade in Africa, because there's this push, there's raw materials in Africa to support the industrialization in Europe. They also need Africa for markets. And for that to happen, they have to do it in a civil way. They cannot be the same as they cannot go about fighting in Africa as they probably would eventually do. So they had these treaties of to how they should go about civilizing Africa or managing the African colonies. And so they draw the maps of Europe after the Berlin Conference of 1888. But like, if you see, like my early argument was to Africa, and this was made by this argument, European colonialism was nothing more than a one-armed bandit, because it was more about taking the economic raw materials out of it. Eventually, of course, we can argue that in the 20th century, things have changed. But when you're talking about the initial push to Africa, it was nothing more than just economic. There was also political reasons that they went into Africa, the Suez Canal being a good example and such. And this just shows, this was on the left, the Cecil Rhodes, part of a push when Leopold annexed the Congo in 1878, around 1880. Already gold had been discovered in South Africa, and Cecil Rhodes had actually laid claim to much of that. So there was this notion that eventually, if it's just going to be individuals annexing Africa, the nations themselves would not have anything for them. And this eagle swooping down is actually Germany coming in when Bismarck also decided that they should join in the scramble for Africa. Again, Achebe is also reacting to this notion that Africa doesn't have a history. And there's that where in the academia itself, until the 1950s, 1960s, African history did not really exist per se. African studies was studied alongside world history. But it was in 1950s and 60s, they started developing in the UK and in the US African studies departments. And it took a lot. It's also a subject of debate if there is really a history of Africa, if Africans themselves could be part of their own history. A lot of that mainly stems from the fact that Africa did not have a lot of written sources. And so for the West, where most of the history was based off critical reviews, text-based frameworks, this was a challenge. Africans have argued that they have their own history, but also doesn't mean that there wasn't any written text in Africa. Islam was in Africa as early as the 8th century. There was some text based on that. The Portuguese were in Africa 1438. In the 14th century, 15th century, mid-15th century, sorry. There was some text that started being written in English then. But definitely it was limited and not spread out. And places more a lot of this was either in areas that had been heavily influenced by Islam or along the coastal trading areas. So just to show you earlier the clip that I showed was from based off a novel by Ryder Haggard. He influenced Theodore Roosevelt, for example, the former American president. And that's where it ties into more what I study, which is the creation of parks in Africa and the way that the West, this aesthetic creation, which Conrad also is, so there's some phrases where Conrad talks of the Pleistocene or prehistoric state that the Congo looks like, you know, the savages in this case, but also just the green, so this, gone over that. Just for some background, we did read about Rousseau, but from a different perspective. But here he does actually talks about the peaceful savage, which ties in, and he's pretty much saying that the peaceful savage is corrupted by the trivialities of modernity. So he's saying that human beings should go back to that natural state. This is taken again when we come into Euro-American environmentalism, where you've got these gleaming metropolises of the East, which people like Henry David Thoreau, Roosevelt, Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, George Catlin, an artist, they see this, they travel out west and they see the picturesque landscapes, and they think that is what they can compete with. A lot of the American environmentalism grew out of this juxtaposition of the metropolises of the East against the Wild West, where they realized they couldn't really compete. If you talk about art or romanticism, you couldn't compete with Europe with their cathedrals and their art at the time, but you could compete with them with these wild plains of the West. And that's part of the history of American environmentalism. Now this, of course, is taken into Africa. So here comes Roosevelt in 1909. He was influential in creation of parks in the US. And he talks about the railroad and the embodiment of the eager masterful, pretty much talking about there is the railroad, but it's going through an area that hasn't really changed from the late Pleistocene. We're talking about 1.8 million to 10,000 years ago, the Pleistocene era, where a lot of the animals then actually went extinct. But this was when he visited Africa on a hunting trip right after he left office, and went through several African countries, including Kenya. And he actually wrote this when he was traveling through part of Tsavo, which is in present-day Kenya, and looking at all this wildlife out there. So there is this Edenic notion, and that goes back to that King Solomon's mines, Edenic notion that Africa is still wild. And this is in the 50s, the 70s, and Achebe sees that there's a problem with this, and a lot of that goes to this. And then, of course, the noble savage, who, in this case, you've got the Maasai that they talk about, for example, there, or the Watutsi in Equatorial Africa, as noble savages, in that modernity is actually affecting all, corrupting their way of life. So that kind of gives you a background as to where Achebe might be coming from. So I didn't want to go deep into all the phrases that Conrad might be going into, but just to give you a background as to where Achebe might be coming from. It might help you, for example, with your paper. But, that's okay.
Well, that was great, because you are now, we have, I know this is an incredibly intense 10 weeks. You've already had one paper on Marx, you just had the midterm, and now you have to think about Conrad. But most of you already read Conrad before, so it shouldn't be that hard, and you know it's short. This is a plus. Even the Achebe article from the 1970s is quite short. So what Willis Okechiogi was helping us with was setting the framework for thinking about the Conrad paper. But let me just say a couple of things about that. One is, there is no correct position to take on Achebe and Conrad. It's up for you to set the terms of the discussion. What Willis has done so well is to explain the long history in which Africa has been used as a kind of foil for thinking about certain issues by the West, by Europe and the United States, both. And the issue is to get behind that, and the issue is also, the goal for you is to think about, what is Conrad doing with this? Is Conrad reproducing the attitudes of the West towards Africa, or is he implicitly criticizing those attitudes? What is he using? What is he criticizing? What is he thinking about imperialism? Is he thinking about imperialism? Just a couple of facts to keep in mind about this. Remember, I showed you the Ride of the Valkyrie and how I played the Ride of the Valkyrie and showed you how it was used in Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. Well, Apocalypse Now is Ford's rewriting of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, set in Vietnam in the 1970s. So that raises interesting issues about how the Conrad story can be read even today as not necessarily just about Africa. So why some critics see in it a kind of investigation of a man's vision of himself and a man's vision of mankind as a group. So in Apocalypse Now, the Martin Sheen character is going off to find a guy who has gone crazy in the jungle of Vietnam, whose name is Kurtz, exactly the same name as in Heart of Darkness. So arguably, the book can be read on many different levels, and it's up to you to decide which level is the level you think it should be read on. What is the level that makes the most sense to you? Is it about Africa? Is it about humankind's inner self and how it works? Is it a problem about men and women? Because the presentation of women in Conrad is, one, mostly absent, and two, where it exists, highly problematic. There are many different ways for you to approach this. And what Willis has done so well is to show you that there is a long history of thinking about Africa that predates even European control over much of the territory of Africa. Africa was the place from where the slaves came for 18th century colonialism. Africa is then taken over partly with slavery, but mostly with other forms of control in the 19th century. So Africa is always there when we're talking about Western civilization. Egypt is in Africa, always seen as an important source in the origins of Western civilization, but we haven't always been straightforward about this relationship between Western civilization and Africa. Now it's even more compelling than ever, now that the going scientific wisdom is that we all come from Africa in the beginning. So Africa is there in the background, and we want to keep thinking about that. Today, I'm going to finish today, though, by putting this in the broader context, as I said earlier, of the issue of what to do with the masses in Europe. Will they go the Marxist route and overthrow the going society? Or will they be attracted, in the first instance, by mass culture, the beginnings of mass culture? Moulin Rouge is founded in 1890. The Paris exhibition, International Exhibition, is held in 1889. And the most controversial thing to appear at the Paris Exposition of 1889. Now, why would it have been held in 1889? What is the significance of 1889? Exactly. It's the 100-year anniversary of the French Revolution, thus proving that the French Revolution lives on even into the end of the 19th century. The most controversial thing to appear at the Paris Exposition. You see in front of you, it led to endless commentary on what industrialization was doing to modern life. And what is this? The Eiffel Tower. What is it made out of? Is it like a cathedral made out of stone and wood? No. It's made out of iron and steel, the new products of the industrial era. We think of it as beautiful today, at least I do occasionally when I look at it, especially now that they've decided to light it permanently at night. In 1889, some people were horrified. How could you put this in the center of a beautiful city when it has actually no function? Its only function now is to go up to the top and eat at the restaurant or get a view of all of Paris. It is not a religious monument. It is not a political monument. It is not a cultural monument. And many people at the time said, what are they thinking to put this up? Okay, so beginnings of mass culture. And I've already raised most of this already, which was that the issue here is how to incorporate the new working classes created by industrialization into the political and social order. And is imperialism related to that? The Paris Commune that we talked about last Tuesday showed there was still the potential for revolutionary upheaval. So this was a pressing issue in the 1870s and 1880s, and certainly afterwards. And just to notice that in this struggle, and this is why the Ferry document is so interesting in the source reader, because Ferry is totally in favor of imperialism and the new imperial projects, but it's clear that the left, at least at this time, is opposed to many of the imperial projects of the French. There was, in fact, a division of opinion. Willis mentioned that the United States saw itself as anti-imperialist right up to the end of the 19th century. It opposed the European carving up of Africa. But many in the countries themselves said, this is an argument we still have today, that this was a drain on the resources that should go to the health and welfare of the home population, that money was being spent on the military and on the administration of the colonies that should be spent for other purposes. This is an argument we still have, and behind the issue of imperialism lies the deeper issue, which those of you in political science or economics should be very much interested in, which is, why does Europe do this? It, in fact, is incredibly expensive. It's the same question we asked today. Why did we go into Iraq? Why are we in Afghanistan? Is it just 9/11? Does it have something to do with multinational capitalism? Many capitalists are opposed to it. Why do countries do this? What is the underlying push? Now, in the 19th century, many critics said, this is just to divert the working classes from their real criticisms of the world they live in. So, just the basic background of imperialism. This is, needless to say, a huge subject, and a fascinating subject, and one that, of course, would merit 10 weeks all on its own. In my view, there's a switch at the beginning of the 19th century away from slavery-based settler colonialism in which the Caribbean is predominant to a more administrative form of imperialism. Yes, Willis has mentioned that in many countries there still is some form of slavery. It's not like it's a free labor force in many cases, especially the Belgian Congo, where this takes its worst form, where workers are forced to work on the rubber plantations. There's a switch from this earlier form that I would call colonialism, of taking over territory and bringing in new populations. In the Caribbean, the Caribs were wiped out. Black slaves were brought from Africa. A small number of whites owned all the land. Slavery, the slave trade is abolished between 1807 and 1848, depending on the country. It's actually still existing in Cuba and Brazil, even after the middle of the 19th century, but dying out in the 19th century. The slave trade dries out. Britain abolishes slavery starting in 1833. The French finally abolished slavery definitively in 1848. As we know, the Americans abolished slavery in 1863, 1865, depending on which act you want to count as most important. Slavery as an official form of labor is ending. What is going to replace it? Increasingly, Europeans shift their interest to Asia and Africa, away from the Caribbean, away from the cotton-producing and especially sugar-producing plantations of the Caribbean, towards a greater variety of economic production coming out of Africa. The new thing that's also going on is deliberate appeals to the masses about imperialism. You see this in Rudyard Kipling. You would see it in the rise of the illustrated daily press, which becomes a factor in the 1870s and 1880s. Everyone now has daily newspapers, and they have illustrations in them of faraway places that, starting in the 1840s, attracts mass interest in Algeria for the French, in other parts of Africa for other countries, and of course, above all, for India for the English. In fact, let me go back to my hidden little Disraeli offering the crown of India to Victoria in 1876. This is a fascinating cartoon. What's with Disraeli here? Disraeli is the English prime minister. Is there something about the way he's dressed that's striking? Is he dressed as an Englishman of 1876? No. He's dressed in a kind of oriental costume, we would say, right? Why is that? Does anybody know why Disraeli would appear in this way in 1876? What's the hidden message here? Does he look like your typical Anglo-Saxon? No. Okay, what does he look like? Right. He comes from a family that was Jewish that converts so that he can rise to higher office. This is also going to be the beginning of mass forms of anti-Semitism that we will see becomes incredibly important towards the end of the 19th century and, of course, in the 20th century, as we will talk about later. Okay. So this Disraeli example is an example of how racism, nationalism, and anti-Semitism will all take more virulent forms towards the end of the 19th century. One argument about this is that this is a way of explaining to people why equality doesn't really work. The Jews are not equal. Blacks are not equal. Women are not equal. I could have also said organized sexism at the same time. And other countries are not equal. We're superior to other people because we're British. We're superior to other people because we're French. We're superior to other people because we're Americans. All these isms are used to explain the lack of equality of people, and they become more important at the end of the 19th century. And many interpret this as precisely another response to this issue about mass politics. The way you keep the masses from arguing for a communist revolution or for major changes that would benefit them is to divert them with how, as white workers, they are superior to the blacks in Africa. As white workers, they are superior to women. As white workers in France, they are superior to the Italians. Whatever is your setup, the point is to say you're superior. So this incredible interest in European superiority that Willis mentioned, that's incredibly important, feeds into this incorporation of the masses into the political sphere without revolution. And then, of course, there will be the issue of what to do with these new colonies. And what characterizes 19th century imperialism will be the rise of interest in what's called the civilizing mission. Primitive Africa will be civilized by the Europeans is how the Europeans presented to themselves. The Ferry document, Ferry himself, is perfectly clear on this. And Ferry is really interesting because he's an incredibly progressive politician. He's in favor of making all kinds of changes favorable to the lower classes. He's a Republican. He is not a conservative, right-wing politician. Quite the contrary. He combines then efforts to improve the situation for the lower classes at home with a defense of imperialism abroad. So it's not that imperialism is a right-wing project. It is conceived in many different fashions. Okay, just two maps from the textbook from different chapters, just to remind you of the incredible change that takes place. Between 1890 and 1914, we go from an Africa in which all these yellow places are local states, local political organizations that control territories, and then we go to an Africa by 1914. The European powers have had various congresses to decide on how this will work. First, they give the Belgian Congo as a private colony to Leopold II of Belgium and let him do whatever he wants to do. There's actually a lot of European criticism, of which Conrad's book is part, of the kinds of policies he undertook, which many thought to be the worst of all in Africa. It is then converted into a state which belongs under the control of Belgium, but in which is no longer his own private personal territory. The European powers get together, make these decisions about Africa. Needless to say, they never consult anybody in Africa about these decisions. And so we see that by 1914, the French are basically installed in West Africa. The British, as that wonderful Rhodes cartoon show, go from Cape Town to Cairo, but are in fact, for the most part, in East Africa, except for Nigeria and the Gold Coast, which will become Ghana. The Germans even have their territories too. The Italians are trying to establish themselves. Being a great power is to control parts of Africa. The problem that this will create is that it will create tensions between the Europeans, particularly over the control of North Africa, which is closest to Europe. Now, this didn't just start in 1890. The French invaded Algeria in 1830. So since 1830, the French had been establishing Algeria as a directly controlled territory from France. It had been under the control of the Ottoman Empire. They use an excuse, as always happens in these cases, to invade, kick out the Ottomans, and take over control of Algeria themselves. This leads to a long and, in some ways, tragic history. Algeria actually becomes, it's a big, big country, becomes a settler colony in that settlers are moved in to take over the land of Algeria. It's one of the few totally 100% settler colonies in Africa. Maltese, Italians, later when Alsatians are pushed out of Alsace-Lorraine after the Franco-Prussian War, all go to Algeria, get land from the government, and establish themselves as farmers and producers in Algeria, pushing out the native population, partly Arab, partly Berber tribesmen, out of their lands and taking it over for the French. Algeria will eventually become a department of France, actually directly part of the French nation, and this will lead to the terrible War of Independence, which we'll talk about later, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. So the big carving up occurs at the end of the 19th century in the era of mass politics, but it certainly starts much before. Okay, I've already pointed out that what's going on the mass politics front now, of which imperialism is a part back in Europe, is what will happen with this incredible expansion of the electorate. This is one of the great issues of Western history. If people get the vote, Why don't they vote out the upper classes? Why don't they confiscate the property of the rich? Why don't they establish an even more egalitarian society? Because what happens after the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, during this period and afterwards, is that it becomes clear that the working classes don't all vote left-wing. They aren't inherently revolutionary. So this is one of the issues is Marx wrong about what happens with the organization of the working class? Now, what does happen is you get the widening of the electorate to men, not to women until the 20th century. You get mass education in this period. You get the legalization of trade unions, finally, most everywhere. And interestingly, you get the establishment of mass political parties. I cannot overemphasize enough how recent mass political parties are. Before the 1870s, there weren't national political parties with platforms, caucuses. Yes, there were parliaments, and yes, there were political groupings. But there wasn't this attempt to organize everyone around the country into political parties. It's a little bit hard for us to grasp this now because, in fact, political parties have become less important in the time we live in. Which party you can change your affiliation. You're not going to have a fight with your neighbor, presumably anyway, because they're in a different political party. You don't go to your local ward meetings to find out what's going on politically. In the 1870s and 1880s, this was incredibly exciting. We had the foundation of national political parties, and they became, in some cases, the most important social organization, besides the church, for your average, everyday person. The question is, was this radicalization, or was it a way of eliminating radicalization? Did the establishment of mass political parties move towards what Marx was looking for, or was it moving in exactly the opposite direction? Because it was about political change, not social and economic change. Dates here, not important. What is important is you start approaching universal manhood suffrage towards the end of the 19th century. There are exceptions. Austria isn't until the 20th century. Russia isn't until the 20th century. One could argue the United States was far behind because it's a state-controlled question, voting. And there were poll taxes in the southern states until the 1960s that were directed against African Americans by having property requirements still to vote. The 19th century could be summed up as the century in which voting goes from being based on property to being based on one man, one vote. And then in the 20th century, it will be one person, one vote. We take this so for granted. When you vote, your vote counts the same as mine. And in most cases, I probably have more property since I'm a lot older than most of you do. My golf clubs are for sure better. I just bought new Callaways. That's why I know. We take this for granted, that your vote counts the same as my vote. Not true in the 19th century. Voting was seen as related to property holding, and that is only given up very slowly over the course of the 19th century. Now, so then, the question is it going to be reform, or is it going to be revolution? And this takes a variety of forms that establish the foundations of life as we know it. So the period of the 1870s and especially the 1880s is the period of growing interest in imperialism, but at home, it is this new way of incorporating the masses into the political structure. Now, I'm going to discuss some of those ways, but I want to look forward a little. Not just to Thursday, but to the next 3 weeks. This will be the issue for modern politics from this period on. And the issue will be why, not just why are the masses reformist and not revolutionary, but how is it that the appearance of mass politics makes possible, because it does, the appearance of fascism and Nazism, both of them mass political movements, perhaps more mass political movements even than the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. But communism, fascism, Nazism are only possible once you get the rise of mass politics. Okay, so this is an incredibly important moment when the elites basically give up on the effort of preventing the masses from being involved in politics. My view is that it's not that they have a conspiratorial plan to prevent them from becoming revolutionary, but you get new mass cultural forms, new mass social forms, and new mass political forms, which mean that these masses are not, in fact, all that revolutionary. But that's still an open question, it has to be said, right up to the 1950s. Between the 1870s and the 1950s, the question is on the table. What will you get if you have mass politics? Will you get terrible anti-Semitic movements? Yes. Will you get revolutionary parties? Yes. Will you get anarchist parties? Yes. Will you get social democracy? Yes. Will you get conservative? You'll get all these options in response to this issue of what to do with the masses. Okay. One important part of this is that to have a successful nation state, you must educate the citizens to feel part of the nation and to feel allegiance to the state. And the question is how to do that with a population which had previously been, in France in the early 19th century, 50% illiterate. In Russia, still largely illiterate, even towards the end of the 19th century. What happens to establish the new Republican form of government in France in the 1870s and especially the 1880s, Ferry is the person, the same person who speaks in favor of imperialism is the person who proposes the laws for universal, obligatory, free primary education. This happens everywhere towards the end of the 19th century and afterwards, not before. And this is an incredibly important move because it says all children will be taught to read and write. All children will be taught that they, in the case of France, are members of the Republic. In the case of Germany, are members of the Reich, the Empire, the German Empire. In the case of Britain, citizens of the British Empire, whatever, the US Republic. A sense of national belonging is created by mass education. It's always in the dominant language, German in Germany, Italian in Italy, French in France. All those other dialects are not allowed in the schools. The schools insist on one national language, and for the most part, the same national education. Again, our education is controlled by the states, but in fact, it moves very much in the same direction. It is where children learn English if they're immigrants. It's where they learn to be part of the US nation as a whole. This starts in the 1880s. Between 1880 and 1886, they get education, and moreover, education that is not given by the church. There is still not separation of church and state in France, but the educational system will be secular and taught by non-religious teachers for the most part. There still are private religious schools, of course, but the public school system will be not religiously aligned. You get, after the 1860s, the legalization of the trade union movement in much of Western Europe and the rise of important national unions. Instead of having your local trade union, now there are national trade unions in order to influence national politics and educate the workers who are voters. You also get, starting in the 1880s, strike movements. Strikes were illegal in most countries before the 1860s, 1870s. Now there will be nationwide strikes, which makes some people very afraid about what is going to be coming. Rise of political parties, I've already mentioned, especially in the 1890s and afterwards. When German Social Democrats first formed a party in 1878, they were outlawed by Bismarck. They were made legal in the 1890s. By 1914, the German Social Democratic Party is not only the largest socialist party in Europe, which it is already after 1890, but it is the largest single party in Germany on the eve of World War I. And in many ways, the German Social Democrats represent a whole alternative way of life. They have their own, they're associated with the trade unions, they have their own social welfare systems. They are an important way of organizing social life in Germany at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. You also have the appearance of syndicalism, which is a trade union movement that's not really based on the trades. It's a union movement that's anti-state, anti-parliamentary democracy, and that argues for, in some cases, a general strike to overthrow the government, and that in some cases, in Spain, in Italy, and France, will lead into anarchist movements. In this period, anarchism makes a very interesting appearance. Interesting because it's very similar in some ways to the period we are in now. Because anarchism in the 1890s, early 1900s, is in many cases explicitly terrorist. There are assassinations, famously of Tsar Alexander II after many tries in 1881, which did not lead to the change the anarchists hope it would lead to. There was the assassination of the US President McKinley in 1901. There were bombings in cafes in Barcelona, in Paris, in all the southern Latin countries. The anarchist movement was quite strong, and there were homegrown terrorist attacks. Setting off a bomb in a cafe to create upheaval to lead to the eventual revolution. I'm going to show you some pictures of that. Last point down here before I get to the Bismarck point, which is a really important one. This is the period when Lenin gets involved in the social democracy movement in Russia in 1898, and he becomes increasingly important after 1903 when there is a split in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, originally much like the German Social Democratic Party, a split between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, which will give rise, of course, to the Russian Revolution. States after the 1860s, but especially in the 1880s and 1890s, begin to implement social welfare policies. There was no Social Security. The only accident or workers' compensation insurance was available through your trade union. Bismarck is the first to see that the state must offer these things or lose its influence to the new political parties and the new trade union movement. So some would see the welfare state as a way of dampening down the revolutionary potential, again, of the masses. Good. So, to sum up, and also maybe if people have questions that they want to ask about the paper, they could, raise your hands if you have questions about the paper, but otherwise, let's sum up what we're thinking about here. Okay. So this is a period in which there's this growing issue about how to organize political and social life. The things that we know of as constituting modern life are taking shape in this period. And what we're going to see is there are at least two very opposed outcomes that are possible. On the one hand, increasing political participation, basically increasing democracy, increasing voice for the lower classes. On the other hand, new forms of mass culture and mass politics that will prove to be problematic, especially in the case of anti-Semitism, racism, and certain forms of what we call jingoistic imperialism. So be thinking about what are the effects? What are the effects of these long-term? And I say especially be thinking about this because this is a prime possibility as a question on the final, which is to trace the rise of mass politics and its consequences over time. So have it in the back of your head. Don't think about it now because you have to think about Conrad. Let us know if you have questions, and let's thank Willis again for his participation today.